channel my inner Philip Bloom here. Hello. No, that's terrible. Don't do that. Hey guys, my name is Matt Johnson, and I was talking to my friend Chris 2 weeks ago, and he said, hey, you should start a video blog featuring training and tutorial things for wedding films. And I was like, well, I've already done like gear reviews before. And he's like, no, just featuring wedding videos and how to get better at them. And I was like, honestly, that's not a bad idea. I mean, it's something that I am passionate about. I've been shooting weddings for 5 years, and there's not a ton of other people doing wedding film training like that. There's Craig Adams at Wedding Film School, and that's all I can think of right now, actually. But the point is that there are a ton of people that are doing wedding photography training, but there's nobody really doing wedding cinematography training. But regardless, I'd really like to get better at helping people film weddings. So with the intro out of the way, this is my first wedding cinematography vlog, and it's going to be focusing on the A7S2, or Mark II, but that's what Canon uses. II is what Sony uses, but that's just Roman numerals, and nobody uses that except for camera manufacturers, and I think the British. We're going to be talking about the pros and cons of this camera today, specifically in relation to wedding cinematography, wedding films, pros and cons of using it to film a wedding, and we're going to go decently in depth. I would also like to thank Stephen and Jordan for letting me use clips from their wedding in this video. So on to the review. I got this camera in mid-October, the day it came out, thanks to B&H's excellent shipping. I've shot 2 weddings with it so far. One wedding November 7th and another November 14th. First off, let's talk about the hardware. This thing is light. I have a battery grip on it, and it's still about half the weight that my Canon 7D was. It being small is actually incredibly helpful because if you're shooting a wedding all day running around, you don't really want something super heavy because you're going to be carrying it around all day. This isn't some set production where you have a ton of people helping, carrying things. You got a DP that's just monitoring everything. This is just you and the camera. So with that, I really do appreciate how light they've made it. Some people complain, they say it's a little small, blah, 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 like it's hard to hold. If you get the battery grip, a lot of those issues go away. You have a nice nook for your pinky finger. Everything fits really well. Secondly, let's talk about image stabilization built in. This thing has 5-axis image stabilization, meaning that it'll handle pretty much how crazy you're shaking the camera. Having come from using Canon and having to buy image stabilized lenses that are about twice as expensive as non-image stabilized lenses, having the image stabilization built into the camera where I do not have to worry about which lens I'm using, it's always on, is incredibly helpful. If you're using a lens that is not electronically connected to the camera like I am, you can actually set the camera to tell it which focal length you are shooting at. So for me, I have to go in and set it to 50mm in the camera, but then it works great. I find that the image stabilization is great for either handheld, because you can hold it just with your hands and it's pretty darn stable with image stabilization on. Easily enough for you to do handheld. And the other benefit, of course, is with a glide cam or a Ronin or a Movi or a Steadicam or whatever else you're using to stabilize your camera. The 5-axis image stabilization will help keep it stable without the need to do any sort of post work, which is really nice. Let's talk about custom buttons. This thing has 4 of them, meaning that you can program a decent amount of settings on the camera and access them very quickly. So for me, I've set custom button 1 to changing white balance, custom button 2 to punching in so I can tap it twice, make sure I'm in focus. I have custom button 3 set to recording. With this camera, the recording button's on the side. It's a little awkward because if you're holding it, you gotta like move your thumb out into a weird position, and it's kind of hard to make sure you've pressed it. Whereas if you just set it, the custom C3 button to recording, it's much more like standard DSLRs, and if you press it, it has a much more satisfying click than the recording button. So either way, it's really nice. You can customize the buttons however you want. Another benefit of the custom buttons is that the menus are complex. I mean, you have literally just settings, just tons of options, which is great. I like a lot of settings. I like everything to be customizable. Who doesn't? But at the same time, it is hard to get to exactly where you want whenever you have 6 main headings and up to 9 subheadings per menu section. Aside from custom buttons, another incredibly beneficial feature is the function button. And that will open up 12 different custom video presets that you can select. So for me, I have mine set to, the first is my steady shot focal length, which is adjustable. The second is my gamma display assist, which I use with SLog 3 and SLog 2, which we'll get into in a little bit. I have peaking. I can set the levels for that quickly and easily. I have my zebra levels, which is very helpful for telling what is overexposed. I have it set to tell me if steady shot is on or off. I can enable or disable it. I usually leave it on. Why would you turn it off, really? I also can change the audio recording level in the functions menu, the ISO, which is accessible through the ISO button on the back of the camera anyways, and a couple other settings that I have not even messed with yet. The good news is that between the 4 custom buttons and the 12 options in the function menu, you can access most everything with this camera very quickly without needing to dig through the menus too much. One con of this camera, and that's more of a con of CMOS, however you pronounce that, sensors in general, is the rolling shutter. So if you're at full frame and you are filming like Cloverfield where you're shaking it all over the place, you're gonna notice rolling shutter. Typically most wedding cinematography is a lot more smooth, slower shots that are a little bit less prone to that. But I do have some friends that film weddings with shoulder rigs, and so they add a little bit of nice subtle shake to things, which can add to realism. But the main drawback of that is that you're probably gonna notice some rolling shutter if you do it. So if you're that type of wedding cinematographer, this may not be the camera for you, or you may wanna look into using the crop sensor mode. For me though, I have not noticed any rolling shutter when I'm using the glide cam, even when I'm using handheld. Let's talk about the feature that most everybody's excited about with this camera, and that's the 4K internal recording. I love it. It's amazing, it's beautiful. If you want to shoot your wedding in 4K and export at 1080p, you end up with a really high quality image that you can also crop in on, which is incredibly helpful for a wedding, say, where you're stuck in the balcony way far back. You can not only zoom in all the way with your lens, you can then punch in digitally significantly closer and really get like the nose hairs of the couple while they're saying their vows. With all the benefits of 4K though, there are a couple drawbacks with the camera. Notably, first off, you cannot use the crop sensor mode when recording 4K. Backtracking a little bit here, this camera has an APS-C sensor mode, which means that if you are using lenses built for cropped sensor cameras, you can still use them on it with that feature. The drawback of this camera is that you cannot record at 4K using the crop sensor feature. I've read online that it is because the sensor is only a 12 megapixel sensor and it cannot handle being cropped down to that size. If you want to use a crop sensor lens, say a Canon 17 to 50 millimeter, or another lens that is not built for a full frame camera, it is not going to shoot in 4K on this camera. You will end up with ridiculous vignetting on the sides. Believe me, I've tried it. With that, you can still record 1080p in the APS-C mode and it still looks really darn good. But I do know that that was one of the main selling points of this camera, is being able to shoot 4K, and you can, but only at full frame, not at crop sensor mode, which may be a deal breaker for some people. Let's talk about slow motion too. This thing has up to 120 frames per second at 1080p slow motion, which is really awesome. What is not so awesome about that is that if you're recording 120 frames per second at 1080p, it is gonna crop in 2.2 times on the sensor. For me, I really enjoy filming the couple in slow motion whenever they're together. So post-ceremony, they're spending some time together. It usually looks better in slow motion, and you usually don't get a ton of time with the couple. It's like a dream of mine to get like an hour or two with a couple, you know, to film them together, but it doesn't happen. Usually they're like, you got 5 minutes. So you shooting in slow motion can really extend that time some and really give you some great clips. If you are shooting in slow motion at 120 frames per second at 1080p, that 2.2 crop is gonna come into play if you are in a time crunch scenario where you only have a couple minutes with a couple and you're trying to change things really quickly, trying to get settings right. If you're shooting full frame and suddenly you're going to 2.2 crop, your focal length is going to be way different and you may not be prepared for that. Just be aware of the 2.2 crop so that way you're not shooting wide and you're like, it looks great, and then you set it to I'll shoot some 120 and you zoom it in and suddenly you're like, oh crap, I'm way too close, I need to go back up and redo things, when you don't have time to do that. I will say though that 60 FPS with this camera is at 1080p with no crop, still full frame, and it is beautiful. So I've been using that instead of 120 frames per second because 120 frames per second is a little slower than what I'm looking for anyways usually. And not having to do with the crop, you can shoot 4K and then you can switch to 1080p, same full frame sensor, which is really nice. Let's talk about how I have my presets set up on this camera. So this camera has video mode, manual mode, a ton of other like portrait modes, scene modes. I don't know, I don't use any of those things except for maybe aperture priority mode when shooting time lapses. Everything else I have set to either 1 or 2 on the preset wheel. Number 1, I have set to record 4K. Number two, I have set to record 1080p at 60 frames per second. The reason being that sometimes I want to go quickly back and forth between the two, and being able to just quickly flip the switch between 1 and 2, I can always get to what I want. When you are shooting very quickly, say wedding dancing at a reception, and you see a shot that's in regular speed at 4K and you're like, that looks good, I wonder if I can get this other shot over here at 60 frames per second slow motion. You can just do one quick flip of the switch and you're back to recording. Last thing about video recording, you are limited to 30 minutes per clip when recording. That's a UK limitation, I believe, because of tax laws. They would tax it as a full camcorder if it could shoot longer than 30 minutes. It's a very arbitrary rule. Just keep in mind that if you're filming a long ceremony that is over 30 minutes, that you come over and you make sure you tell the camera to start recording again after 30 minutes so it doesn't stop. Let's talk about lenses here for a second. I'm using Sigma art lenses with a Nikon mount. The reason being that I can then adapt these Nikon lenses to most other camera systems with adapters. So this Sigma lens will work on Canon cameras with an adapter. It will also work on Sony cameras with an adapter. And the other nice benefit of it is that I have clickless aperture adjusting. It's like butter whenever I adjust my aperture. No clicks. It's fantastic. So right now I'm using the Photodiox Pro Nikon to Sony adapter, and I'm receiving in the mail later this week their ND throttle adapter. So it's a lens adapter that has an ND filter built into it, which is really exciting to me. So we're gonna try that out, see how that works, and hopefully I'll be able to review that in the future. Because I'm not using the ND throttle, we need to talk about ND filters for a second here too. I use something called Zoom adapters, XUME, which are magnet adapters that go onto the end of your lens, and then you can take an ND filter and just stick it onto the lens incredibly quickly. So if you're shooting a wedding and the couple's like, let's go outside, and you're like, oh, because you've been inside and your camera settings are all set to it, and it's a bright Texas day, sunshine everywhere, you're gonna run into issues with overexposure, even with stopping the camera all the way down and going down to ISO 50. The best benefit is to have a good ND filter, and the ability to just stick it on and be like, okay, I'm ready to go outside, is wonderful, versus, hold on, let me screw this in and try not to cross thread it, and hold on, don't kiss yet, let me finish this. You don't want to have to do that, really. Come on. Let's talk memory cards. Specifically, you're gonna need some stinking fast memory cards to use this thing. And what sucks is that I feel like every few years I'm like, I get time to invest in newer, faster memory cards that are the same price as the old ones, but it's okay. I'm currently using SanDisk 95 megabits per second SD cards in this camera, and they're working great. Specifically, I would not recommend buying anything lower than 128 gigs if you are planning on shooting weddings with it. At 4K, recording 24 frames per second, I have 2 hours and 44 minutes of recording time with a 128 gigabyte card, which is not nearly as much as I'm used to when I'm shooting in just HD. So keep that in mind. I have a 256 gigabyte card that I just ordered that I'm gonna try out. I think the SanDisk cards run for 90 bucks right now for the 128 gig, so that's not too bad. Let's talk about battery life for a second. Specifically, if you read any online forum about any of the Sony A7 line of cameras, any of them, you will read horrible reviews of people talking about battery life that say that this thing is gonna die in 5 minutes. That's not true at all. Battery life is gonna last you a little bit over an hour, which per battery, that's a pretty short period of time, let's be honest. But we're shooting a wedding. We're not shooting some big corporate event where you gotta have the camera running all day. We're shooting something where it's turn the camera on, get a couple shots, turn the camera off again when nothing else is happening. And with that, I've found that I go through approximately 3 to 4 batteries a wedding. And that's with me filming 12 plus hour wedding days. As a way to combat the short battery life, I would highly recommend getting a battery grip. Now this thing, I think it runs 350 for the official Sony model, but batteries are something I do not skimp out on. I think that it's important to have a camera that actually works, and I've read horror stories about short circuiting and things like that with off-brand battery grips and accessories, so pony up the money. If you're dropping $3 grand on the camera, drop another 350 bucks on the battery grip and buy some Sony batteries. I have 6, and I've never run out of power throughout the day, and I haven't ever had to charge at a wedding either. One of the best features of the battery grip is that the camera drains each battery individually, and it will tell you the battery level of both batteries on the camera. So whenever you are recording and your camera says you're about to run out of one battery, it will automatically switch over to the other battery. You can pull out the battery tray The batteries are clearly labeled. You can remove the dead one, put a new fresh one in, and go back to shooting. It's not quite hot swapping, but it's close enough that you should not have any problem with running out of battery life throughout the day. I would also look into buying one of the Watson dual battery chargers. They make a Sony mount for the charger, and if you buy that, you can charge 2 batteries at a time pretty quickly. Video quality. Let's get back to that, which is one of the biggest things that people care about here, especially with Sony now putting SLog 3 in this thing, which is pretty crazy to think that they're putting the same cinema gammas that they're putting in their high-end f55 and f5 into a $3,000 mirrorless camera. I'm not complaining. I think it's awesome. One wedding I shot completely in SLog 3 with this camera. The other wedding that I shot was in a modified Cinema 4 profile. I can say that the SLog range is fantastic, significantly higher than anything I've had with my Sony FS100 or with any of my Canon cameras. And the main benefit of shooting in a flatter profile, especially at a wedding, is that you don't really have a ton of control over the current lighting situation. So for a reception, I bring a light to light the dance floor, but if you're filming, say, the bride getting ready, you're not gonna go in and set up like 3 studio lights around her. And whenever the guys are hanging out, you're not gonna go have time to set up a crew and set up all these soft boxes around the room and be like, look, it looks beautiful. You're not gonna have time to do that, it's a wedding. With that in mind, having a camera that is able to handle a very wide dynamic range and being able to correct a lot of things in post is incredibly helpful, and that's one of the things that I really do like about SLog 3. The main benefit of SLog 3 is that regardless of what you're shooting or where, if it's a mixed lighting scenario, you got tungsten on one side, fluorescent on the other, and the sun shining in out through the other side, you can fix some of that in post when grading, and the camera is able to handle a wider range of color, brightness, highs, lows, everything in between. One of the unsung heroes of this camera is the Gamma Display Assist. You can have the camera set to shoot in SLog 2 or SLog 3, but on the viewfinder, in the menu settings, you can change it so the viewfinder shows you an artificially graded image. So whenever you're filming, you're not like everything looks gray and washed out. It boosts the saturation and the contrast enough where you actually know what you're looking at. And you're like, oh, this actually looks really great. Hey, okay, cool. One of the drawbacks of shooting SLog, though, is that the minimum ISO when shooting it is ISO 1600, which is still better than the first A7S that was 3200 ISO. It is still going to be quite a bit brighter if you're outside. Aside from stopping down a little bit when outside, I would definitely recommend going back, getting an ND filter if you're planning on shooting SLog 3. Another con of SLog 3 is that because this camera is shooting in 8-bit, if you push the grade too hard, you're going to get some banding in, say, blue sky or other things like that. So be aware of that. If you are dealing with a lot of blue sky, maybe, or it's a super sunny day wedding, maybe you should be shooting in a different picture profile. Just shoot in the dark if you're having problems. Speaking of the dark, were we talking about the dark? We should talk about the dark, because that's the other main thing about this camera. Not only is it 4K, but the low light is stupid. This camera sees better than my eyes at night. I wear contacts, I don't have good eyes, so maybe I'm not a good reference for that, but this is amazing. You can handle extreme darkness in any condition with this camera, which is amazing. Say you want to take the couple out in the evening time and it's already getting pretty dark and the photographer's complaining because their autofocus won't work. That's not an issue for you. You can still take that couple out and you can film them in near total darkness. Or say that you are filming the reception on the dance floor and it is dark in there because they want everything to be really dark and moody because it's prettier. But you're also thinking, oh no, this is gonna suck. And if you were on, say, a 5D Mark II, it would suck and everything would be super grainy even if you have a 50mm 1.2 on it. But because you have the A7S, the glorious low light, powerful A7S that you do, which is amazing, it's not an issue. I have shot slow motion at 60, at 125 shutter speed, at ISO 20,000, ISO 30,000 with this camera, and it looks fantastic. The other benefit of the low light is, say you're shooting the ceremony and they want it really dark for the ceremony, and you got a long lens, but it is an f2.8 or an f4, and so you're trying to get close enough, but ideally you'd be shooting like a 50mm 1.4 or 1.2 to be able to get it bright enough to compensate, but then you're too wide. So the benefit of this is that you can use your long lens that's slower and not nearly as good in low light, and you can set your ISO as high as you need to make it bright enough so that you can see everything you need to during the ceremony, regardless of which lens you're using. That is a lifesaver. Let's recap. Overall, this camera is a real workhorse. It can handle highlights with SLog. It can handle super dark scenarios with its amazing ability to go to super high ISOs and still remain super clean. It shoots 4K internally. It has built-in image stabilization no matter what lens you're using. The battery life is not a problem if you have a battery grip, and you can carry one of the batteries in your pocket too if you need an extra because they're not that big at all. I really like this camera. Can you tell? Can you tell I love it? I'm really in love with it. It's glorious. I will say that SLog 3 is a beast and is more work to grade properly. So if you're on a time crunch and you're like, gotta get this wedding out quickly, say if you're shooting a same day edit, I would probably not shoot an SLog. But if you are wanting something that gives you an amazing dynamic range in super bright light and in darkness, this camera is great for that. What I'm most interested in is trying out this camera with the new Sony FS5 that's coming out really soon. I feel like with the Sony FS5 shooting 4K and this camera shooting 4K, this will be an excellent B camera, and the Sony FS5 will be a good A camera. I'm planning on using both for shooting weddings, and we'll see how it goes. But hopefully I'll have a review coming out soon for wedding films featuring the FS5, which should be really exciting as well. So if you want a camera that can record a wedding in mixed lighting conditions, either light or dark, and you want something light that's not gonna break your back to carry around all day, and you want something that feels like it has a little bit of magic in it that's this good, I would highly recommend the A7S2 for shooting weddings. Is it perfect? No. Do I wish that it could shoot at 10 million ISO and also make me tacos? Yes, that would be great. But unfortunately at this point, it's not quite capable of doing that. Maybe a firmware update will fix those two things. But if you're shooting weddings, I'm having a difficult time finding something that works better than the A7S2. Thanks for watching my first wedding cinematography vlog. Please let me know if you have any questions, if I didn't cover something, if you're like, well, that was wrong. I'm not an expert. I've only had this camera for a month. But I figured that it'd be really helpful for someone to make a review that was a real world example of what it's capable of. I'm planning on video blogging some weddings in the future, like as I'm shooting them, and some other stuff too. Please leave me a comment if you have any questions or feedback or anything like that. You can also reach me through my website, WhoisMatt.com, and my wedding cinematography site, Filmstrong Productions at filmstrong.com. Thanks and have a great day.